Hello and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today we're going to be discussing conflict. And when we think of conflict, a lot of times we think of war, and we've been talking about states and what makes a state, and borders, and territories, and territoriality, and things like that. And usually those are the things that people disagree about. And so, first of all, we want to define war. And when you talk about a war, you're talking about a state of prolonged, violent, large-scale conflict, and it can involve two or more groups of people or political communities. So you can have tribal warfare, you can have international warfare, you can have world war, things like that. All right, so why do people go to war? Well, all the usual things. There's conflict over land, natural resources, could be water, could be food, could be minerals, whatever. There's conflict over values and ideologies that people just don't agree on the way things should be run. You also have racial and ethnic hostilities, and those can cause wars and conflicts, and then you want to defend yourself against hostile attacks, and sometimes that's threatening. And then of course there's revolution, and revolutions can be successful, they can fail, they can be good, they can be bad. And then there's nationalism, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But ultimately, when you talk about war, most of the time you're talking about a failure of peaceful resolutions, and it doesn't mean that people didn't try to work things out diplomatically, but sometimes it just doesn't work out, and a peaceful solution can't be reached, and so war becomes the final option there. Okay, so when we talk about war, it's played a huge role in the development of civilization. You start out with all of these tribes, and they're in small groups and villages, and you have alliances forming to defend the territory, and you see this more with sedentary populations. When you start having cities and settlements and things like that, you're going to be more likely to defend those because that's where your resources are, it's where your home is, it's where your food is, and you can't really just pick up and go someplace else, and you probably don't want to. And so as these alliances get made, and as victors take over territories, you start to have larger groups, and these turn into chiefdoms, and eventually you get large territories that become states. And this is some of the stuff we were talking about when we talked about kinship. Now, one of the things that really helps decrease war is industrialization, and as nations industrialize, they're less likely to go to war. However, with industrialization, you get technology, and with that technology, most of the time, war can be much more destructive because your tools are more sophisticated, and a lot of the times they're more lethal. Your soldiers typically are more trained because in an industrialized society, you can actually have a military that focuses on just that. That's what it does, instead of being just civilian soldiers. And standing militaries often are civilian soldiers. That's a whole different thing. But instead of doing civilian things and then just being soldiers when the country or when the state needs you. So industrialization changes that. And technology is interesting because war actually furthers technology, and that brings us to the idea of dual-use technologies. And so a lot of these really cutting-edge things that are used in the military also have commercial and civilian applications. Now, for a while, when those new technologies come out, it's very proprietary, and there's you have to get licenses, and there's limitations on who can use them. But as they become a little bit more outdated, for military use, they become more public use. And so some good examples of those are lasers, underwater equipment, diving equipment. This is a Navy diver, this picture over here. Navigation systems, acoustic software, all kinds of things. Okay, so when we talk about types of conflict, there are the traditional conflicts, and that's really what you think of when you think of war. And there are two kinds. There's the intergovernmental, which is state to state, right? So like World War I, World War II, those sorts of things. And then there's, they don't have to be that big. It can just be between two groups too. Intragovernmental, and those are going to be your civil wars. And then you have your sort of standoff wars, and that would be a Cold War. And of course, the Cold War was the standoff between the United States and the former Soviet Union. And in that case, everybody was armed to the teeth. It's just that you had something called mutually assured destruction, MAD, that kept either of those groups, either the alliance of nations with the U.S. Or NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, And so that kept actual traditional war from happening between those two groups. Now, one of the things that you see a lot, unfortunately, are going to be your nationalistic and your ethnocentric conflict. And this is what we were talking about in the very first part about causes of war. This is where you're talking about ethnic differences or cultural differences. Now, first of all, before we start talking about that, it's important to understand what nationalism is. Patriotism is not nationalism. Patriotism simply means to have a sense of belonging to your country, to be proud of being a citizen of your country, to work towards, being a good citizen, to have an affiliation. Nationalism, on the other hand, is really thinking that your country is the best and then is superior, and because they're superior, they have the right to take over other states, right? And so it's very important that you understand that being a patriot is not the same as being a nationalist. Now, having said that, being affiliated with your country and being proud of your country and all of those things are very important, but it's also important to understand that the government does not actually make your country necessarily. And a really good quote by Thomas Jefferson that reminds people not to get carried away with being supportive of a particular government instead of a state or nation is this nice quote right here. Okay, so back to this whole nationalistic and ethnocentric conflict. There are three big ones that have happened fairly recently that you might be familiar with, and that would be the Rwandan genocide, where you had two groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, and the Tutsis were the minority, and the Hutus set out to exterminate them, and so you had a genocide, and in less than a year, 100 days, less than half a year, in 100 days, almost 1 million people, Tutsis, were killed. And then a lot of the Rwandans actually fled into Zaire, right, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And when the Rwandan government went in to get these displaced, these refugees, it ended up in a second genocide, and so now you had an intergovernmental issue in addition to an ethnocentric issue. And then Bosnia was one that we were actually involved with. But in the Bosnian War, you had the Serbs versus the Croats, and they were both aided by Serbia and Croatia, respectively. And it turned out that the goal of both sides was ethnic cleansing. They wanted to get rid of the other group, and that's because they had a long, long history of not getting along, and this turned out to be a really, really horrible human rights issue, and both of the leaders, particularly the Serbian leader, Milosevic, Slobodan Milosevic, sorry about that, ended up being tried for war crimes and convicted and all this good stuff. And the leader of the Croats also was convicted of war crimes, although he hasn't actually been jailed at this point. Okay, so moving on from these kind of large-scale, you also have these non-governmental conflicts. And the ones that you probably see most often, because you see them on the news, is going to be organized crime and gang wars. And those are not the same, but they kind of fall in the same category of these groups that are fighting over something usually not legal. And then there's guerrilla warfare, which is different than traditional warfare in that it's asymmetrical, whereas traditional conflicts tend to be symmetrical. Okay, so guerrilla warfare, a really good example of this was the Viet Cong in Vietnam, and what you have are just these small groups of individuals, and they oppose either their own or foreign governments and their military forces, and then they just kind of hide out and wait and ambush. That's what they do. All right, now moving on from that, in some cases, when you're talking about guerrilla warfare, you could, in fact, be talking about terrorism. And terrorism is something that is different from these other kinds of conflicts. And so when we talk about terrorism, we are talking about the premeditated use of violence to gain some sort of political or social objective. And there are two types, and that would be domestic terrorism and transnational or international terrorism. And they mean what their names imply. Domestic is within the same country. International is across borders. Ultimately, it is a policy that is intended to terrorize people, right? And so it's to instill fear in people to make them do whatever it is that the terrorists want them to do. And unfortunately, terrorism seems to, well, in all the places it is, and there's all kinds of terrorist groups, and they're all over the place, it seems to be something that is targeted for young people. And so young people are very impressionable, and you can actually convince and raise people with certain ideologies that will make them more likely to join groups or just become terrorists. And this is just an interesting thing. This is from the U.S. Department of State, and it was a math question that came out of one of the schools in Afghanistan. Okay, now, when we talk about the typology of terror, we are talking about three big kinds. There's state-sponsored terrorism, and you probably hear a lot about that. There's two components to any type of terrorism. You've got the internal and the external. And in state-sponsored, it's mass terrorism as a tool of repression or oppression. And the objectives are to terrorize citizens to prevent them from rising up against the state. Okay, and it undermines other states who are involved in situations, or it can undermine weak states. Now, you also have revolutionary and insurgency movements. Sometimes these involve assassinations. There'll be tactical terror, which is against government targets. Sometimes they're related to cultural or religious conflict. It could be secular versus religion or religion versus religion, but a lot of times they are religious. And the objectives in this case is to change whatever the current policies are or to remove current leaders. And they do it by destroying the morale and the will to fight of all of the people who oppose them. Now, you also have these transnational networks, and this is a fairly new thing in the last maybe 40 or 50 years or so. This is where you have these things that are planned and executed by people, planned in and executed by people who are in one country, but they do it someplace else. And a lot of these things are to convince these target countries to behave in some way, and often the reason is to fight imperialism, even though the countries that are being targeted are not imperialistic at all. And so it's really ultimately to spread fear, reduce morale, and to reduce confidence. So when we talk about some famous terrorist groups, you probably have heard of most of these. The IRA was the Irish Republican Army, and they bombed all sorts of things. And keep in mind that when you're talking about terrorists, you're talking about people who indiscriminately or intentionally harm civilians, predominantly innocent civilians. And so you've got the IRA, you've got the Red Brigades, and the Red Army. They were both Marxist-Leninist groups, one in Italy, one in Germany. And then there's the PLO, which was the Palestine Liberation Front, and then there's the Palestine Liberation Organization, and now there's the Palestine Liberation Front. And then two that you're probably very familiar with are Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Okay, and Al-Qaeda, of course, Al-Qaeda, is responsible for 9/11, but they had been doing these sorts of things for a very, very long time. So there's just some examples of some other terrorist acts. Now, terrorism has been changed significantly by technology, and you get this really escalation of power and this ability to cause casualties. And one of the reasons that you have that is new technologies and explosives, new ways to hurt people besides explosives, like nerve agents, bioweapons, stuff like that, but also new delivery systems. You have the capability of strapping bombs to somebody, making a suicide bomber. You can put them in cars. You have missiles. You can set them off with cell phones. There's all kinds of things. And there are also better defenses, and there's better intelligence. And so on both sides, actually. So it's good for people who are fighting terrorists, and then terrorists also have that too. And then communications are really big. You have, with cell phones and computers and things like that, this change from kind of piecemeal and slow communications to really accurate and instantaneous information. And again, that's also on both sides. Okay, so when we talk about terrorism, lots of people have been killed over the last decade by terrorists, and you can see that it's escalated from about 2000 to the president's dropped off, and then it goes up and down, but it's still at a fairly high level. And you can see that most of the terrorism is occurring in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. The next largest area, by the way, is South Asia. And when we look at, you can see on this graph here, 2006 was a big year, and when you break 2006 down, you can see that lots and lots of people all over the world were affected by terrorism. But obviously the Near East is going to be the most significant group. Okay, and when you look at terrorism risks all over the world, there are terrorism risks almost everywhere. Greenland seems to be the only place that doesn't really have a terrorism risk, and it's because there's no data, and also not lots of people live there. It's a little icy. But when you look around the world, there's really a lot of risk. And there's extreme risk. We're low risk. But there's a lot of activity going on all over the world. So when we talk about back to Al-Qaeda, because that's something that we're all pretty familiar with, you can have a single group that's actually global, and this goes to this transnational, and again, that's a relatively new thing. But Al-Qaeda actually operates in at least 35 countries, right? And they're constantly moving because they don't have a state that they are a part of, and so they're just these extremist groups. And they're also in Canada, the United States, and in South America as well. And so what you're just looking at is Africa, Europe, and Asia, but they're kind of really global. So why? Why do people engage in terrorism? They either are oppressed or feel oppressed. They feel like they have a limited voice or a limited ability to fight back using peaceful methods. They often justify their conflict because they think that it's moral or necessary, and it doesn't really matter if they're innocent victims, because they don't really see that the victims are innocent, because it's kind of like, if you're not with us, you're against us. Or there's some religious or ideological motivation that drives. And so the idea is that you have this cause, and the ends justify the means is really where that goes. And because of that, there are terms that you hear like freedom fighters and liberators and urban guerrillas, but if you really think about that, it seems that you would not be able to fight for freedom by oppressing, terrorizing, and killing your own people, innocent civilians, things like that. So that's an important thing to think about when you hear these terms sort of tossed about. All right, now, when we take terrorism versus warfare, there are some huge differences there. And there's a sort of qualitative difference between the two types of violence. And in war, there are rules and there are norms of behavior that keep it as civil as possible. And war is always going to result in lots of damage, lots of casualties. It's not a good thing there. But there are these rules of engagement. And in terrorism, there's not, okay? And the rules really protect innocents. They protect people, even the fighters, from different kinds of weapons. There are weapons that are designed to inflict all sorts of damage, and instead of just other kinds of damage. But there are some weapons that are off limits, some tactics that are off limits. And also it's very important to understand that there are certain targets. You can't go for civilians, diplomats, medical personnel, chaplains, anybody who's surrendered or who is injured and unable to fight. And so there are these rules that are very important. And it sort of keeps everybody on their, as good a behavior as you can have in war. But the terrorists don't really follow rules of engagements, and so you can see civilians who've been taken hostage and are executed. Military officers are kidnapped and murdered. There are human reigns that are desecrated, and that's something that the moral nations don't do. You don't drag somebody through the streets after you've murdered them. And then there are just all sorts of attacks on just innocent people, blowing up shops, blowing up school buses, indiscriminately firing into crowds. Those are all things that are against innocence. And attacking embassies and diplomatic installations, and then setting up and conducting military operations from religious structures. You cannot operate out of a religious building according to the rules of engagement, because religious buildings are protected targets. And so it's unfair, if you will, for someone to run into a religious building while they're shooting at you. Okay, so here's just a little breakdown of war, traditional war versus terrorism, and this is for you to check out. Okay. Now, no matter what happens, anytime you have conflict, at some point it would be great if you could broker peace. And you really do that. First, somebody generally surrenders or says, hey, let's work this out. And there are really two ways that you do that. There's mediation, in which you have this third party who sits there and helps the two groups negotiate and come to some sort of arrangement. And then there's arbitration, where you have essentially a judge, right? It's kind of like a court in a lot of ways, where you have the two sides present their arguments, and then this third party comes up with a decision, and both parties have agreed to accept that decision before this process starts. Okay, now, it turns out that there are wars all over the world, and they're ongoing, and some of them have been going for a really long time. But here's a list of some of the wars that are being fought right now. And so these are the countries that are involved, and of course what the actual conflict is, and sometimes this is who it is or where it is. A lot of these are going to be uprisings, insurgencies, rebels, things like that. Anyway, so if you want to check any of these out, they are pink because they are linked to some information about each one of them. So if you have any questions about conflict, then please ask them at the beginning of class next time, and I will see you then. All right, thanks for listening.